Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm David Gibson. I'm the director of the Center on Religion and Culture, based down at the Lincoln Center campus. And I want to welcome you all to our event this evening, Synodality, Catholicism's Past, Present, and hopefully future. It's so wonderful to be up here at the Rose Hill campus. We hardly ever do anything up here at this campus. And on a night like this, a dark November night in this Gothic kind of hall, this is what university life, this is the university vibe for me. Let's just hope we don't do this entire event in Gregorian chant. We're very pleased to be able to put on this important event on this critical theme. And we're also pleased that we have this event is not just a CRC event, it's also co-sponsored by Campus Ministry, the Department of Theology, the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, and the Graduate School of Religion and Religious Education. That alliance, that collaboration, I think, is an indication of how important this topic of synodality is to the Church and to Fordham University. Now, synodality, it's such an odd sounding word, and yet I can't think of any term that's more consequential for Catholicism in the United States and around the world than this process of, what shall we call it, consultation and dialogue within the Church that Pope Francis has launched, or rather relaunched. Because, as they say, there's nothing new under the sun, but it certainly can seem new to us. Fordham wants to be a participant in this global process, and in fact, the call to synodality demands that of Catholic higher education. So we've gathered a truly distinguished panel of theologians and historians here really to help boost our ongoing dialogue on synodality and the future of the Church. With us to my far left is Rafael Luciani, a Venezuelan theologian and advisor to the Vatican's Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops. Do we even call it, Rafael, the Synod of Bishops anymore, or is it just the Synod?
Still the Synod of Bishops, but the Secretariat is the Synod.
Good, okay. It's all changing. Raphael is currently serving as an associate professor of theology at Boston College. His most recent book is Synodality, A New Way of Proceeding in the Church. It's from Paulist Press. We have flyers out there. You can use the QR code to buy it. It's a terrific survey. Susan Bigelow Reynolds is an assistant professor of Catholic Studies at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Her research examines the intersection of ecclesiology and lived Catholicism. She has a new book from our own Fordham University Press, People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Ecclesiology in Catholic Roxbury. And we also have, again, a flyer out there for that title. And finally, Brian Flanagan, an associate professor of theology at Marymount University, who specializes in ecclesiology and church history. His most recent book is Stumbling in Holiness, Sin and Sanctity in the Church. And he's currently writing a book on Pope Francis's efforts to integrate the practices of participation and transparency in the Catholic Church. And Brian, maybe you'll tell us more about that. Real quick, before we go to Brian, we'll go to Brian, Raphael, and then Susan with brief opening remarks, just 5-7 minutes. Then I'll open with a couple of questions, and then we're going to flip it to you all. Please write down some questions, have something to ask of our panel. Most important, please silence your cell phones, but not social media. Feel free to live tweet or Instagram or whatever you do. You just tag us on, David, what's our Fordham handle again? At CRC Fordham. So tag us in any live tweets. Okay, so first let's go to Brian Flanagan for some of his thoughts on this moment in the church.
Thank you, David. It's a real honor to be here. I feel in this distinguished company. Somehow they let me in on the side. I'm going to speak a little bit. I've got three main points. I've been thinking about synodality for a while now, and that description was my attempt to figure out how do you say synodality without saying synodality. I'll talk about that in a moment. But where I'm going to be starting from, they actually know what's really going on. So I'm excited to hear some of our reflections and conversation about what's actually happening. I've been starting from a slightly different place of asking, well, what is this thing? Where does it come from? How new is this? How is this different than other forms of shared discernment and decision-making in our church, but also in the other parts of our world? So I have 3 points. The first big point I have is synodality is a strange word. If you've heard, probably some of you in your parishes or some of you in other things, that we're having the synod on synodality, and your first response is, what the heck is that? And so there's a way in which the strangeness of the word can make us forget that the actual reality is not something new. It might be a new word and a new way of encouraging it, especially new to our Catholic experience in our own lifetimes. But arguably, synodality is the most traditional form of discernment and decision-making in the Christian community. This is an old practice. If we want to look to the meeting in Jerusalem that happens and is reported in the Acts of the Apostles, or look at the various ways in which Christians in the first centuries, in the medieval period, in the modern period, all thought that, well, how do you have Christians coming together to discern the path forward? Their answer was not a kind of monarchical, authoritarian decision-making, but rather a form of coming together for mutual listening and shared discernment. Even the council at which we declared belief in papal primacy and in papal infallibility happened at a council, happened at a gathering, had to be done a way in which to give that legitimacy meant that people had to come together asking for the fruits of the Holy Spirit. So synodality might seem like a strange new word, but the actual synodal practices have been a part of our kind of ecclesial DNA, a part of our structure for a while. We'll talk, I'm sure, about how, and I think especially in the last 200 years, we've gotten less good at using those muscles. And a lot of our growing pains right now are about getting these synodal muscles back. But we also have these pockets, more than pockets even, these places where we've been doing synodal things in the Catholic Church, even more recently, that can be easily overlooked. So if we want to think about the encuentro processes among U.S. Latino Catholics, if we want to think about women's religious communities in the forms of shared discernment and dialogue they've been pioneering, especially in the post-Vatican II period, we have these places, some of the experiments that happened right after the council in parish governance. We have some places where synodality or synodal church has been coming into being. What's exciting about this new change is now we're all being invited, I think, to enter back into it. The second point I want to make is to think about where does this come from? And one of the bugaboos, or one of the cheering sections, depending on how you look at it, is the question of, isn't synodality just bringing democracy into the church? This is what I hear most often from my friends who are more critical of what's going on. The church is not a democracy. And from my friends who really like synodality, yeah, we're finally becoming democratic. And I want to argue there's some good reasons to think about how this is different than democratic electoral structures. It's rooted in a different understanding of the person, rooted in a different understanding of the community. And the starting point for that is that synodality is an extension of our Eucharistic assembly. Synodality is a liturgical act. I often say to folks that it's not supposed to be a meeting where you have some prayer at the beginning and some prayer at the end. It's supposed to be meeting together as a form of prayer, as a form of worship. And as Catholics, we constitute that in a way similar to the way in which we constitute our Eucharistic assembly, in a way that still has distinctive roles, distinctive charisms, distinctive roles for those who are ordained, so that if you were waiting for this to simply be a majority vote of everybody in the community, that's not quite what's going on here. But in the same way that when we celebrate Eucharist together, we have different roles, different forms of full and active participation, this is saying that even in our governance and even in our discernment, we should still be driven by our baptism, to share in that same full and active ecclesial participation. In some ways, we've been running our ecclesiology for a while now as though the primary sacrament driving the engine of the church is ordination. And this is a refitting to think that the primary sacrament driving the engine of the church is our baptismal vocation, most fully expressed in the Eucharist, but also expressed in the synodal assembly. The third point that I want to make is to think about the challenge of that in our world today. So when I'm sure we'll get into the conversation about some of the ways this is practically working or practically not working. One of the challenges, I think, is how does this differ from, if it's not democracy, how does this also differ from strategic planning? And I think that's a real hurdle, perhaps, especially in parts of at least the world here in Anglo-North America that I'm most swimming in, where we're used to corporate strategic planning. And I think many of our people bring some of the same suspicion to the reality of synodality that they bring to when corporate tells us that we're going to figure out a new mission statement or vision statement. So figuring out how to keep this as a discernment experience, keep this as a prayer experience, keep this as an act of fidelity to the gospel, that's going to be one of the challenges. If you read the most recent summary, the summary that's been sent by the Vatican Synod Office for the continental stage, which we're going to hear more about, I hope, one of the things it says is it needs to be read with the eyes of a disciple. So how do we keep this from becoming a bureaucratic, document-based back and forth between offices and make sure that we're still experiencing this at its various levels as an act of worship? So that's three of the things that I wanted to bring into the conversation to start us.
Raphael?
Well, thank you so much, because it's for me a joy being here and talking about with you this topic that is driving the church, and even if it's difficult, because we are in a transition. Any transition is always difficult for everybody, even those who are in favor or who are not in favor. So the church is in transition, and we can ask which is the ecclesiology behind this process of synodality, and specifically what is being put into practice in the Synod on Synodality. So I want to share 4 points. And the first one has to do with the point of departure of synodality is to recognize chapter 2 of Lumen Gentium, People of God, as the normative character of the church and interpreting the church and understanding our dignity as subjects. So that means that it's not a new thing that Pope Francis brings. It means that it's the recovery of what Cardinal Swenens and Monsignor de Schmidt during the council's debates brought together, and by setting a sequence in Lumen Gentium, they were offering a hermeneutics. So first we have Church as Mystery, then we have second chapter of People of God, and then we have hierarchy, and then we have the other ecclesial subjects. And Swenens, by putting the chapter 2 as People of God, all other ecclesial subjects, bishops, laity, presbyters, religious, men and women, are now interpreted in the light of this notion that defines church and ecclesial life. And this brings together, in this current phase of the reception of the Council, 2 texts of Lumen Gentium that we are seeing in practice in the Synod. Lumen Gentium 12, Sensus Fidei, and Lumen Gentium 23, the ecclesiology of the local churches. This is where we are. We are bringing together these 2 notions and ways of being church that turned ecclesiology in ecclesiogenesis. That means that we are in a church in which we are not anymore to understand the church with a fixed notion, but as a process of reconfiguring relations, communicative dynamics, listening, discerning, etc., and structures, parishes, pastoral councils, and other more. So this is the first point. We are in this conjunction of Lumen Gentium 12 and Lumen Gentium 23 in the framework of an ecclesiology of the people of God. A second point, this notion of people of God, as it has been defined in many, throughout many works of theologians in the past years, is understood as people of God in a place, in a culture, in a social, political, economic setting. And that is also a process of reconfiguring the church. And in this second point, this process is revealing another normative character of the council that for years we have lost, bringing together ad gentes and lumen gentium, a church in mission. But this bringing together ad gentes and lumen gentium is understood as a process that begins with the testimony, the mentalities, the relationships, towards the building of ecclesiality, the community, and then finally reaching out the institutional form of that ecclesial life. And that institutional form is embodied then by this notion of the ecclesiology of the people of God as a subject and as a missionary, and today we say a missionary and synodal subject. So in this second point, I just wanted to set the framing of how this process also implies a reception of ad gentes and the light of lumen gentium. A third point, the challenges that we are seeing in this process that mean a reconfiguring, but this reconfiguring implies some still juxtapositions that the council left open, unresolved, and that synodality is today trying to have a vision from where, or a hermeneutics from where to see these problems. A first one is the relationship between collegiality and synodality. This means, how do we situate the identity and the mission of the hierarchy, and specifically the role of the bishop, within the people of God as one more faithful? Francis, since the beginning of his pontificate, has spoken about how the Pope is a faithful, Christi Fideles, the bishop is a faithful, the presbyter is a faithful, the religious, men and women, is a faithful, the laity is a faithful. This is a recovery of the dignity of all of us as baptized. And it's also an overcome of an interpretation that was done on the council as a council that had centered its own proposal around the cult, liturgy as cult. Well, today we have recovered the reception of the council that is not about cult. That is the consequence, that is the changing part of the reception. But the reception of the council, when we bring together the collegiality, relationship and communion among the bishops and the bishops with the Pope, and synodality, centers the life of the church around the Word of God, Dei Verbum. So this is another key to understand synodality. The bishops and all ecclesial subjects have to live in equal relationships around the Word of God. And therefore, when we say that collegiality should be inserted, situated in the light of the people of God, in the current process, this would mean that a bishop should participate in the same consultation process with the rest of the faithful. If he doesn't do that, he is not a bishop representing that portio populi Dei, that means the diocese, and he is the witness of what he brings from the life and the doctrine of the faith that comes from this relationship among the faithful in a place, in a portion of the people of God, which is a diocese. And this is also a challenge for the synod. We have seen synods where bishops are simply appointed to say their own opinion without any connection with the people of God in a diocese. And we have seen also throughout the pontificate of John Paul II, how many bishops were appointed without having pastoral experiences, just to have an appointment in an office such as the Curia. So this connection, collegiality and synodality, is very important. And the other juxtaposition and challenge to be resolved is the relationship between primacy and collegiality. Collegiality implies also the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome cannot exercise its own function and mission and identity without being himself inserted in the life of collegiality. And this is a problem in the Council because the Nota Previa of Lumen Gentium, that is not part of the Council because it was not voted but inserted in Lumen Gentium, had that problem unresolved because the minorities that were supporting the primacy and trying not to lose the primacy had that note as kind of a consensus making, and the majority could advance by bringing collegiality, the novelty of the Council. So this is also today a situation that is also to be resolved. And a case, to end this third point, is when we see in a synod, if the synod, which represents collegiality, reaches a final document which represents the discernment of those bishops among themselves, what does the Pope do afterwards? An Episcopalis Communio brings the reform of that specific point. When Episcopalis Communion, which is a constitution that reforms the synod, offers the possibility to the Pope to assume the final document and not to write a post-synodal exhortation. So there is an opening, again, to resolve this. And the synod, synodality, in the current situation that we have been living and seen, puts that in an emergent praxis through this circularity, which is completely new because it brings sensus fidei, communio fidelium, communio ecclesiarum, and in this interaction you have a circularity. And this circularity is expressed through the different phases, but now specifically in the continental phase, with something that appears at the end of the document that is the complete novelty to explain this phase, to give back the document, because the document expresses the voice of all the faithful, and when I say faithful, again, including the bishops as faithful, and it's given back to be accountable, first time in the history. So it is not a theological document precisely because it's giving back to the communities the words that the communities said. And it's important to, when we read the document, to see how nothing was excluded. Nothing was excluded. And an experience in one diocese, in one part of the world, that we can imagine many alike, there was a topic of ordination of women, and this bishop was in the situation in which many people in other communities were saying, wait, we cannot put that, other bishops the same. And the response he did was very interesting. He said, if we are listening and those words come from the rest of the faithful, we have to be respectful for those words. And this is interesting because this was generated by the interaction that enables this synod to be in the same table with a bishop, a lay, and a presbyterate, and a religious. So this second point is, third point is to say that this juxtaposition, collegiality, primacy, has an open way, an open path to be at least thought in light of a solution. And the fourth one is the missing link. What is the missing link of all this process? If we have the sensus fidei recovered, if we have the communio ecclesiarum, the communio among local churches, which is this continental phase. Now comes the difficult part, the consensus fidelium, the consensus of all the faithful, which is the process that is ongoing. And it's interesting here to finish that the consensus is being put into practice, because this circularity means that we're learning how to give back the words, be accountable for those words. Then comes again another dialogue among the local churches, and this dialogue is going to discern from this document the priorities of each continent, not at the universal level in a generic or abstract way, but at the continental level. What does the African continent says? What does the Asian reality says? What does the Latin American or the European or the North American? And that's a new way also to understand consensus, because what if in one continent the priorities are completely different as in the other continent? Then we have to learn that the church is not universal in the sense of abstract. Universal means the communio ecclesiarum, the communion of the local churches interacting among them with and the Pope. So this is the last point that I wanted to bring, that we are building this culture of consensus, and it's not new. In the preparatory document, there was quoted a bishop that could be said is very prophetic for us today, but his practice, as many other bishops in the first millennium, was based in two things, very simple: consulting with his presbyterate, but then, he said, St. Cyprian of Carthago, building the consensus with all the people of God. And he said, if I have the consultation and the advice of my presbyterate, but I do not reach a consensus with the whole people of God, I have to continue the process. This is where we are today. Thank you.
Susan.
I want to echo my colleagues in saying how thrilled I am to be here, and I also want to just lift up the name Stefano Montano in this space. He was a colleague of mine at Boston College and was a postdoc in theological education at Fordham, and died of cancer last year after a very protracted battle, and was so embraced by this community, and he was a good friend, and I miss him dearly. So just wanted to say his name in this space that he loved. Excuse me. The work that I do looks at the experiences of laity on the ground. And so that's really been where my attention has found itself focusing throughout the past couple years of this synodal process. And there's a piece of the document that was released on October 27th that I want to point our attention to, because some of us might be wondering, what is a synodal church? And the document actually answers that very question. What is a synodal church? In paragraph 13, it says, this means a church that learns from listening how to renew its evangelizing mission in light of the signs of the times, to continue offering humanity a way of being and living in which all can feel included as protagonists. And I want to invite us to pause for a minute and dwell on that word protagonist. It's unusual enough in English, right? In Spanish, it's used a lot more, widely protagonizar. But in English, we only really hear that like in AP Lit, right? When we're reading narratives or watching movies, who's the protagonist? We don't have a habit of using that word to apply to like real people like ourselves. And so it's striking, right? In English, it's a striking term. Protagonist, right? What does it mean to be a protagonist in the church, right? It connotes this sense of agency, of personhood, of self-determination. The document actually in another place contrasts the notion of protagonism to passivity. It critiques this church in which the priests are protagonists, so-called, of the liturgy, and laity assume a passivity. And the other thing that I think is so interesting about the notion of a protagonist is that a protagonist is necessary to the story, right? You can't read a book without a protagonist, right? It's a vital character, right? So when we talk about the faithful, all the faithful as protagonists, what we're saying is, how do we come to understand all people in the church as necessary, right? As understood as equally necessary to the mission of the church? How do we realize that equal dignity given to us by our baptism? And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First, that notion of inclusivity we are included as protagonists in the church is really important, because just like Brian said, a lot of the critique that's come, at least from an American perspective, of the synod process is that you're taking these sort of like corporate civic virtues like inclusion and suddenly making them like ecclesial virtues without a lot of like robust theological grounding, so-called. But I don't think that's the case, right? Because what the document is saying is that it's not just about inclusion in this really sort of superficial, benign way. Inclusion means creating an ecclesial culture in which people can bring their full humanity to the church and have their voices heard in ways that are authoritative and meaningful to the structure of the church per se. It's also important when we think about this notion of missionary discipleship, right? This idea of a centrifugal church that goes out. If I think about my kids, right, I have 3 girls. They're all under the age of 8. And unless they know that I'm going to be there, right, they're not going to go off and play, right? I'm always like, go play, my God, go play. And they, no, where are you going to be? Are you going to be here? What are you doing? I want to follow you around. I'm going to be right here, right? I'm not going anywhere. You go play, go to the playground, right? Go outside, please. Children need trust that the parent or whoever, the caregiver, is going to be there for them in order to have the freedom to go out, right? And in a similar way, right, all the faithful need to deeply in their bones, right, understand that this is, unless there's a relationship of trust with that institution, then how do you expect anybody to go out and be missionary disciples? And so this is, just to say a couple more things about this notion of protagonism. I think it's important too, because one of the things that I spend a lot of time studying is the sexual abuse crisis. And especially over the past couple of decades, we talk a lot about this like crisis of trust in the church. And when we say that, when we say there's a crisis of trust in the church, what we typically mean is that there's a perception that laity do not trust the leadership of the institutional church. But I think there's also a simultaneous crisis of trust in the church, which is that laity don't feel that the institution trusts them. If you think about it, I can't think of another tradition in which such a large proportion of adherents self-identify as bad, right? Think about how many people you know, even like church-going Catholics, who identify as bad Catholics, right? If we have a large number of folks in the church self-identifying as bad Catholics, that is not a group of people who sees themselves as protagonists, as trusted in the eyes of the church. In fact, it's just the opposite, right? I think most people understand themselves in some way as caught in this sort of, if not antagonistic or adversarial, at least very suspicion-oriented relationship with the church, right? I don't feel like the church trusts me as an agent of my own moral decision-making. I don't trust the church because of failures of leadership and failures of transparency, right? And if you're in an institution in which not only do you have a problem trusting your leaders, but you also do not feel trusted as a full subject, a full adult in the church. That's not a space in which you can be free to go out in joy to proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. A story that I want to tell really fast, and then I'll turn it back over to David, is that I teach at Candler School of Theology, which is a Methodist seminary, part of Emory University in Atlanta. And so even though I teach Catholic studies, most of my students are not Catholic. And I teach one of the courses that I teach is sort of a congregational studies course. And I realized one day, this was several years ago, through, just classroom conversation, none of my students were Catholic. I realized that a third of my students were Catholic, had been born and raised Catholic. A third of my students in this Protestant seminary class had been born Catholic, raised Catholic. All of them happened to be women. And I was just fascinated by that. And so we kind of got into a conversation, what happened? I'm so curious. And it was what they said has stuck with me since then. And it came back to me again, and as I was kind of reflecting on this idea of what it means to be a protagonist, a full subject in the church. I was so fascinated because none of them were like, I hate the church, or I feel betrayed by the church, or I disagree with the church's teaching. There was no anger there. There wasn't even real categorical disagreement. In fact, what all of them said was effectively some version of, I wanted to be a full subject in the church, and so therefore it was only natural that I found, PCUSA or, United Methodist Church or the Episcopalians, and they said it with such humility. Well, I really felt called to lead, or I really felt God calling me to preach. So, and so of course, then I had to find, it was almost like this natural movement for them away from the church of their birth and their childhood and towards communities that recognized the depth of those gifts in them and allowed them to respond in love to God's call. And when I was sort of reading and reflecting on the document for the Continental Stage, the DCS, that came out a couple of weeks ago, and I kept seeing that term over and over again, this protagonism. What does it mean to be a protagonist in the church? I thought back to my female students who all expressed some version of that. And I thought, this names in ways that I feel like I haven't been able to yet, sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about what laity want in the church. I think there was a lot of hypotheses, right, about why this process was slow to take hold in the U.S. I think a lot of people have a lot of different, we were talking about it beforehand. I think the pandemic didn't help. But I think when it comes down to it, people don't have an experience of being consulted in ways that aren't optional, right? In ways that whoever, the pastor, the bishop can't just take or leave, right? Some of you have probably served on parish pastoral councils or diocesan councils. I've been on the parish council. My husband is currently on the parish council. Even in really sort of collaborative, just communities, that's a consultative body, right? This is a sort of, everything that's said there could be taken or left. There's no accountability and no need, right? And frankly, no structural place for any of that to go, right? I hope we talk a little bit more about this, say. But I think that's why the process was slow to take hold, right? People, and they weren't cynical about it, right? It's not a rejection. I don't have any experience of anybody in any position of power within the church saying, what do you think? and then taking that answer and holding it and saying there is something authoritative about what you just said. And so for me, that's the most important thing.
Just wonderful insights, each of you, and wonderful stories. It's so powerful. Raphael, the people of God, Susan as trusted protagonists, Brian in the most traditional form of discernment in the church, ironically. While you all are formulating questions, let me ask the first one of all of you. These are wonderful insights, and this is a wonderful process, but let's pull out that more. Why do we see so much opposition or suspicion of this, Brian, traditional process? What's going on, and especially in the United States, let's face it.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before as well, but to fill you in on what we were doing in the green room, right? I mean, some of what you need to address is the deep-seated habits of lots of U.S. Catholics. So I want to put to one side, we have people who, for various theological, or sometimes it has to be said, ideological reasons, find any conversation about these topics that should have been decided about women's roles in the church or the roles of LGBTQ folks. We've already figured that out. Why are we even talking? I want to put them to one side and talk about the larger group of folks, I think, who we just don't have much experience of doing that. That's the thing I heard most often from people I was talking to is, well, the church has never asked me, notice they're still making the church a them. The church has never asked me what I think. So I think there's a way in which that this is a new way of being Catholic, and I think the specificity of the U.S. Catholic experience is also still has a kind of hangover of 19th century immigrant patterns of looking at authority figures in the community that have merged into continuing patterns of looking at authority leaders as, well, that's what Father's job is, not my job. I'm supposed to just sort of, we've effectively created a situation in which we're still supposed to pay, pray, and obey, and in which many of us, it must be said, kind of like just paying, praying, and obeying. It's a lot easier to do it that way. And the last thing I want to throw in is I want to contrast, I think the experience that Susan had with your students, I think really rings true for a number of Catholics and former Catholics of trying to figure this out. But I do want to address also, I've heard a lot of, not cynicism, a lack of trust, a fear of the ecclesiastical Lucy pulling the football back again, especially from Catholics who had this experience immediately after the Second Vatican Council of deep hope that something was changing, deep hope for the possibilities, and then felt that rug pulled out from underneath them. So I think that I'm also seeing and hearing in some of my circles some of that same, are we going to try this again? I got burned really bad last time when we tried this. So that trust, thinking about it in terms of trust, I think is a really important starting point for this.
Yeah.
Susan, you. Yeah.
I think that's all a really good point. I find myself really thinking about lay reactions to both in 2002 and 2018 clergy sexual abuse revelations. And after both of those pieces of the crisis, you saw this real burst of lay initiative and lay energy, lay desire to do something. And so if you look after 2002, right, you got like Voice of the Faithful, for example, which was started in the Boston area by Catholics who were frustrated with the lack of accountability and transparency on the part of bishops. And I think the motto was, keep the faith, change the church. But because there was no place structurally for that lay energy and contribution to go, right? There was no place to put that within the institutional structure of the church. What happened is that before long, that organization became an antagonist, right? To kind of use the language of protagonism again, because there was nothing else for them to be. And so, a year or two into the crisis, you had the bishop saying, no, okay, you got all the organizations at the parish level, all the local chapters of Voice of the Faithful that have formed, you can stay, but no more new parish-based chapters. It's also interesting about an organization like Voice of the Faithful was, it was older, right? These are folks that had time because they were retired, very, very wealthy, very highly educated, very white. And there too, not exactly like a representation of the church. These are folks that felt very frustrated with the institutional church, and who were also very politically progressive. And so, it didn't really become a model for what sort of like lay initiative was possible within this larger body. But I think it's one of the clearest examples that we have of real lay commitment and initiative to being part of the institutional structure of the church, and how even the most, organized and ardent efforts atrophy after a while, when they simply have no place to put that energy within the church. If you look at after 2018, after the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, I belonged to a Jesuit parish in Atlanta, and there was just a tremendous lay-led effort after those revelations came out to do something, right? And it was this like something, we don't know what. And so there was the kind of a group formed at the parish that I think called it leadership. It was a leadership crisis response committee or something like that. And the priest was all about it, and he said, "Do your thing, laity." Awesome. It was really interesting, actually. They did a parish-wide examen because it's the Jesuit parish. So the laity during the homilies were invited to come up and lead this parish-wide examen and invite people to like write down their hopes and dreams and feelings and thoughts about the church in this moment of crisis. And it was actually this really, just as an ethnographer, it turned into this unbelievable data set, basically, of like 900 responses to, it was kind of like a proto-synod in a way. And this group was so organized and so energized. And even that, right, it was like trying to plant a sunflower in like a dome, right? Like a glass dome. After the roots took, it sprouted, but there was no place to grow.
Yeah. Brian.
I have one small detail just to jump in for a second. I really resonate with that imagery and that idea. And I was at that inaugural Voice of the Faithful meeting in the big janky conventions, the old convention center in Boston. And I think the detail that really shows you the limits of the imaginary at that point was, what was the big action at the end of that first weekend? They were going to write a petition to the Pope.
Yes.
Which shows the sort of grasping for a model, for a way of participating, drawn mostly from civic society, that still also imagined the Pope as something more like kind of the CEO of the company. And so it reminds me of a bit of when, say in the 1960s, people were looking outside of Christian religious traditions to try to find meditative practices because we had forgotten our own meditative practices of centering prayer or things like that. There's a way in which we've been looking for ways of participatory life in our church, and now we're finally being a chance to go back to our roots, to the actual idea that if you are baptized, if you are part of the Christian faithful, your voice is crucial for understanding where we walk together.
That's great. Thanks for bringing up the Voice of the Faithful thing. We have met before because I was in the same auditorium covering that whole Voice of the Faithful upsurge, and that's a great, just recalling that and all the stories I wrote about it, but it had no place to go. There was no place. It was all just like, oh, are we trustees or are we that? So, Raphael, what to you is is it ideological opposition, cultural opposition? What is the real source of the problem?
Yes, I think that first of all, it has to do with the way in which the council is received in each part of the world. And second, the cultural basis that receives the council. So in regard to the first, We can say, for example, in Latin America, the reception of the council went through Lumen Gentium, the Church as People of God, and Gaudium et Spes, reading the signs of the times. And through those documents, a church that engages society was natural in our places. So through that perception, at the same time, for us became practically our language, ecclesial language, saying people of God. But what lacked in that reception? They called for a reform of the structures. And right the time after the council, there was a theologian, Ronaldo Muñoz. He was the first, he was from Chile. He was the first one to say in his first book that the church needed to reform mentalities and structures in order to put into motion that reception of the Church of People of God, and the signs of the times would be that nourishes the church and in terms of what to change, how to change, where to change. So I guess that, if we bring it to other contexts, in the case of the US, the reception highlighted more Nostra Aetate, which is a way in which the institutional side of the church practically needs to reinforce an identity because it's not a majority and has to define the limits in regards to others, confessions and society in general. And that made that the reception in the US was not a communal reception. But that embraces also what I said as a second point, that the cultural basis in each locality in the world is the base where the reception occurs. In Latin America, the communal spirit, the communitarian spirit is natural. When we go to drink a coffee, a Latin American or Italian, you just go to the bar, ask a coffee, and you were thinking just to enter and go out, and then you are there 45 minutes talking with whom you were drinking the coffee, and at the end you have a friendship, no? Here we have the culture of the cafes, where you see for 4 or 5 hours people sitting down just to feel that someone is there, but no connection establishing, no connection, no relationship. But the need to have someone at my side and feel that I am in a space with other people. The cultural basis then means that the way in which I see the other and interact, if that is natural, the reception of the people of God would be simply the ecclesial way of living that. But if in my context, the reception is based on a culture where individualism is exacerbated and the church is seen as an institution, there is a disconnect. And this is, I think, in my few years only here, I think that is happening, no? In the U.S. church.
Thanks. Let's go to some questions from you all. Over here, David. Gentleman up here. Yeah, just one moment. He'll give you the, wait till he brings you the microphone. There you go.
Good evening. Dr. Reynolds, first of all, thank you and I appreciate your comments about Dr. Montano. I was fortunate enough and blessed as well to probably have be in his last class at Fordham on culturality 2 years ago, and then he unfortunately, started to go downhill pretty good. He was a real gentleman, a great scholar, in my opinion, but a better human being for sure, and that shone through his style of teaching more than anything else. So thank you for bringing that up. I can't help but, as you mentioned that, think what a wonder world he would be in right now with the Synod, and trying to see how he can incorporate that into his curriculum and as well as his lifestyle. So, thank you. I have one major question, if I may, but just to shortly digress. I teach in an all-girls high school in Long Island, and we took on the project last year that our Diocese of Rockville Center, one of the largest in the country, took on, like most dioceses, and we decided to see how we could incorporate that into our school curriculum. So grades 9 through 12, every one of the grade levels was involved to some degree in doing a synod project, if you will. And our comments were forwarded to the diocese, and although we were very skeptical in the beginning how closely they would actually look at our comments, especially coming from this all-girls school who doesn't necessarily get a lot of shine from the diocese, if I may say that. But it was fairly well received. And now I teach this course, and I'm trying to figure out, in conjunction with writing my final paper at Fordham University called The Synod on Synodality, believe it or not. And I have Dr. Harrell sitting over here, who's my mentor, teaching the course at Fordham. So all my worlds are coming aligned with synodality. But I struggle to find out how to not make this a one and done situation in this school. These are, if you want to mention cynicism, some of the words you brought up as to what the resistance levels are, we were met with quite a bit of cynicism from these young ladies, and not just on the synod itself, but in the Catholic Church in general. And I'm trying to navigate that and see how I can take this synod on synodality, make it into a working project. So that's my little foreplay. Just if I may ask this question, how, Dr. Luciana, how will the papacy ultimately determine what consensus is?
Good question. Big question.
When Pope Francis wrote Evangelii Gaudium, there is a sentence there that is very strong, the conversion of the papacy. And if we see the trajectory, the first years he spoke of pastoral conversion, and then he moved to synodal conversion. And in synodal conversion, he added listening, but he added reciprocal listening, and then he added where each one has to learn from the other. So it's in his way of understanding, and if we see this synod, it's also a learning process for the church. We are not outside the institution. And to put an example, we started this synod with 2 years, 2021, 2023. Now we have to change the logo to 2024. Why is that? Learning process. There was not a fixed idea. And even if we compare it to the Synod of the Family that had 2 assemblies, those 2 assemblies were not of the same status. These 2 assemblies have the same status. So it's another way completely different of understanding synod. And it's a learning process because there is not one person that knows exactly how to define this process. So everybody's living the process in the way in which we are also learning how to figure out that this process should lead to a consensus. And I think the difficulty sometimes, and Zoom helps to solve this difficulty sometimes, is that we should be more interconnected in different cultures, in different ways of being church. I had a Zoom 2 days ago that was a surprise because some youth people contacted me initially from Africa. When I connected the Zoom, I had youth people that are leaders of communities in Mongolia, in Pakistan, youth people in different countries of Africa, interacting among them, dialoguing among them, and even if they said really critics to the church, at the end, they, by seeing each other, they found that each one of them was doing at least one thing. So I think that looking beyond our locality, it's already a big step.
Brian. Oh, no, go ahead.
I wanted to say something about the comments that you made on women, on young women. because if you were gonna talk about Raphael's, because this is sort of like a different, I was just very, very struck by that. And I think just thinking about how do you continue this process and not make it like a one and done, especially in the context of a women's school, a girls' school. It's such a good question. And I think what's so interesting to me about the Synod working document is, so I'll tell you about this thought experiment that I always do. Whenever I read a Vatican document that on the role of women, I pretend that I am an alien from space. And I got this document, so I have no context, the Roman Catholic Church, or gender, or earthlings, it's like this is this total veil of ignorance. I have this document, starting from zero, tabula rasa. What conclusions could I draw, knowing nothing else, about this community of women based on this document? I've done this dozens of times with different papal statements. Every single time, without fail, the conclusion that surfaces is women are all exactly the same. Every single woman is the same as every other woman. They have an articulable essence. They have limited and also articulable gifts. There is one way to be a woman. This is how you are a woman. And also it's impossible to do this because our icon of womanhood was virgin and mother, and you cannot be both of those things unless you are immaculately conceived, which I know I am not. I don't know if any of you are. Let me know afterwards if you are. And when I read the section in the Synod document on rethinking the role of women, I found myself implicitly doing this thought experiment again. If these 6 paragraphs were all I had to go on, what conclusions could I draw about women in the church? And I really do think that even this is not a magisterial document, not a theological document, but it is a Vatican document in a way, right? It's the result of this commission. It was put together by this group of laity and clergy and bishops. And I think it was the first time I've ever read something like this, where I have not come to that conclusion, right? For the first time, it was reflected back to me that women, the billions of us, are not all exactly the same, right? And we also don't agree on everything, right? Should women be ordained to the priesthood? People have different opinions. What about the women's diaconate? People have different opinions because women think different things, because there are billions of us, right? But to see those statements, right? One of the statements in there from the Holy Land report, which was stunning to me, not because it expressed anything that was like new or radical, but because it was in there, right? And they said, women have a lot to gain from this process because we are speaking from the peripheries of this institution, right? We are on the prophetic edges of this institution, which was so fascinating to me because in one statement that didn't come from the US, didn't come from San Francisco, wasn't a Western, this was from the Holy Land report, right? It said women don't offer their gifts to the church because we are naturally humble or because we are so maternal, right? It says what we're offering to the church is our outsiderhood, right? So anything that you think we're contributing to this process is a result of the fact that we are marginalized within this institution. It was a stunning inclusion. So I think, again, just from the perspective of teaching from a girls' school, right? How do we use a process like this to let young women know that there are a lot of different ways to be a woman in the church? I thank you for your comment.
I also wanted to lift up what you were saying about your experience in a different way, because I think that there's 2 things. One is about how does this continue? And I think that if this is the last time we have a global synod, then Pope Francis has failed. This is meant to be a starting iteration of not just a series of discrete events, but a way of being church. And so my question that I think you have entirely the right instincts of, well, how do we keep doing this? How do you keep doing this so that instead of it being a special thing that you do in your high school or in our parish or in a university or in a wider church, instead of it becoming a special thing that we need to figure out how to do, it simply becomes the way in which we do church together. So that naturalization of our ways of being church is part of it. And the second thing I wanted to lift up, so I think, and Raphael is doing amazing work, and the Global Synod is doing amazing work, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the Synod of Bishops meetings in October of 2023 and 24 come up with. But I think for me, one of the big important takeaways of what's happening is that the meeting of young girls in your school to think about what they want is just as important as the global conversation. And that way in which we're learning how to have these local conversations might end up being more important to a particular parish than what gets decided at the Vatican Synod meetings. So I think holding up this way in which learning how to do this, learning how to be together, learning how to listen to each other, learning how to be in spaces and create room for voices that are not heard to be heard, that is as important as any particular document that comes out at the end of it, as beautiful and as hopeful as many of them are.
Amen. Raphael was making me feel bad about all the bad things I've ever said about Zoom. That was...
I want to say, in counter distinction to what you just said, if women, and I was struck by that same paragraph, I can't find the number, I want to say it's 61 or something. There's a quote from the Holy Land that sounds like San Francisco in some ways, followed by a quote from Korea. If there is not some real appreciable change over the next 6 to 7 years, I'm not sure I'd give it 10 years. In the role of women, those girls on Long Island are going to do what you're talking about. Yes, I was the generation that left kicking, screaming, and being obnoxious and arrogant. Neither of my 2 children are Catholic. My grandchildren are not Catholic. That was, by the way, I'm not saying that as something I did that I'm not saying I couldn't. I was so troubled when I left that I took them with me, but they were lost. These girls on Long Island are, this generation is the women you met. They're not angry, they're not screaming, they're just saying we need to get on with our lives, and we don't experience any air. I was really taken with that sunflower in the Bell Dome. And what I saw in that report reminds me of the sex abuse crisis when it hit in the 1990s. The Vatican said, oh, that's the United States. They're litigious. It's not happening anywhere else. And then for 40 years, one place after another after another. And what I think I saw a glimmer of in those paragraphs that surprised me was women across the globe are starting to have different expectations about being individuals with differing gifts to offer. And I think unless something happens soon, it's going to be the process of the crisis repeat. What I see there is the crisis is already starting to hit in the Holy Land and Korea. And I think we're seeing a global chain reaction. And if the church cannot respond to this, I honestly find it hard to envision what the future for the Catholic Church is. There will be one, but I can't imagine it.
Can I just put that into 2 points? That's a very good comment. As they often say, if the church loses the women, it's kind of done. For Raphael, I guess one thing that struck me in those reports, everyone said, it's what you said, the Americans are concerned about women, gays, LGBTQ, clericalism, and yet in those reports, Raphael, there were so many commonalities across. You can't say, I mean, there are cultural differences, but there were a lot more commonalities. My question is, there are expectations like those, and we see in some areas, Germany, obviously, the most advanced and neuralgic. In seeking consensus, is the church will the church be able to have different answers in different places? And I think that seems like it's perhaps a crux of the issue.
Yes. As I said in the beginning, we are a church in a transition. That means in a transition of the ecclesial model, institutional ecclesial model. And that's not easy, not immediate. To put an example that this implies a process. We just had the reform of the Curia with a constitution, and in that reform that does not appear much in the media was a huge reform that is claimed in the reports, but many of us don't know. By separating the potestas of order, the power of ordination, a bishop, a presbyter, and the potestas of jurisdiction, the power in the exercise of an office, of a function, right now women have the same decision-making, elaboration, and decision-taking in the Vatican. The challenge: how do we then translate that into dioceses, into pastoral diocesan councils, into pastoral parishes council? So we have now advanced in the theology that permits that. We have to advance in how to make that possible. How do we do that? And this is not the problem, but the thing that we are still missing as a church, raising our voices, claiming, not simply claiming what we want, but also what it's already there that we have to put into practice. In the reports, it is true that there is a commonality among all the issues, and that means that the problem of the church is systemic, is structural. It has to do with the institutional model, not with certain things here and there. But that also means that those people who said that were the people, in the report says, the majority were the people who lived in a parish or ad intra, let's say, in the church. Many have said, well, because the church didn't go to the society with speaking with the atheists and the agnostic. What is interesting is that means that there is a consciousness ad intra in the people that before never spoke because they were afraid of the pastor, of the bishop, of issues that today are being spoken with freedom. So my point is, let's try to look of the possibilities that have been given that sometimes we don't know, and let's try to think how to push that, because the possibility is already there. And the others that are not still there, that's the challenge that we have, theologians, pastoralists, every person in the church. No?
Right. But your question there raises a good point too, that also thinks, how do we redefine or learn to understand what Episcopal ministry looks like? Or what being a leader of a parish looks like, or what the particular charism of the Bishop of Rome is, because we've had a kind of unity maintained by enforced uniformity in many places, or a kind of a form of authority in which, well, at the end of the day, the parish council can be consulted, but then what Father says goes. And so if we're going to have a form of unity that is trying to allow for difference and trying to keep everybody together at the same table, literally, my biggest concern is this: we've gotten very lucky with the Pope that we have, who has these particular skills, but we haven't been training our seminarians, we haven't been helping. In some ways, this document, one of the things about the synodal, the continental stage document, it doesn't quite know what to do with our clergy anymore. And in some ways, it talks about how the clergy feel in this process. Well, what am I supposed to be doing now? Because they're being asked to take on a new role of maintaining unity, not by decree, but by facilitation. And that's going to be a real culture change that I have real questions about how we do that.
Yeah. May I say just something brief? Reform is form and reform. We're lacking not on reform only, on formation. And this is a challenge of universities, that instead of only forming for a professional academia, the universities have to go the exit and offer formation for all the people, not simply for those who want to be professors of theology. And this is a huge challenge, because the change is not going to come from the center, the seminaries, to the peripheries, but backwards. As we form the consciousness, that peripheries come back to the church, and that creates this circularity. So I completely agree. Without a reform of ministry, of ordained ministry, there will be no reform of the church. But the reform of ministry is from the peripheries and the universities, because that's one of the points that in the document says, universities and faculties of theology or engage in the process of formation, or we will continue to be an elite in the society with less significance every time more.
But
I have two questions for you, and the first is a question that you've sort of talked about a little, but I'd like to ask you to address it more directly, and that's, could you say more about the kinds of faith formation that are needed for synodality to take root in the pastoral life of the church? And that question comes out of the work that I do with both ordained ministers and lay ecclesial ministers, in which I've talked with them about synodality as not being just about the ecclesial culture of the church, but it being about ministry, and it should permeate and transform the way we do ministry. And I talk about that with students, and they go out and then try to create synodal practices in their ministry context, and they come back and talk about how difficult it is. You know, that some people will come back and they'll say, some people come into a synodal process and they'll say, oh, this is our chance to democratize the church. And they'll say, no, that's not what synodality is about. Other times they'll say, like, they'll have people they'll invite to be part of a synodal process, and the response they get, the response in one case, and I think it's typical of some of the attitudes of people, somebody said, I can't come and be part of that kind of process. I'm just a pip. I'm just a person in the pews. What do I have to contribute? And then they'll also talk about how when they do manage to create synodal processes, sometimes what comes out of them are polarizing conflict between people in the church who have different perspectives, and then they have a whole another problem to try to manage because of their efforts to bring synodality into the ministry of the church. And as I've talked with them, the sort of where the conversation has come back to is if we're going to do synodality, how do we form our faith communities to do that? And
Second, yeah. Was that the question, or do you
that's
want
the first.
That's the first one. Okay.
But I can stop there so we give everybody else.
Okay. Let's do that one first, and then yeah.
I think it's a great question. What I think is so important about considering a question like that is thinking about, like, how does formation happen? And formation happens not so much by content, right? It happens by culture. So I think of my students, right? They're formed by the content of their courses, right? But they're formed, you think, even more so by the culture of the seminary. You think of our priests, for example. I'm sure that they're formed by the content of their courses in seminary. But I think it's pretty clear that they're formed in an even deeper and more intractable way by the culture of seminary formation. And of course, I mean, I keep talking about the sexual abuse crisis, but we saw this issue come up in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis, and thinking about what do we need to do to change this sort of formation that priests are receiving. And it's not so much about changing what they're being taught, right? It's about changing the space of seminary. It's about changing the culture of seminary formation, which changes how you're taught to interact with other people and collaborate with other people and converse with other people and welcome the leadership and the co-responsibility of other people. And so I think in that respect, we have a long way to go, because even if priests now, let's say, I'm just talking about priests, but obviously formation is a community-wide thing. But, so even if now we're talking about synodality, right? What's the culture of those spaces of formation, right? Are you being formed into the kind of minister who knows how to collaboratively engage with the faithful? Or are you being taught that you're isolated in this space because you're special? And no matter what happens, you're still going to be the most special one in the room.
And it's a process of conversion. Mm-hmm. And I also want to keep, again, I think that our clerical formation is one big part, but also our people's formation is a big part. I mean, the other thing that your question gets at, I think that needs to be why many Catholics of goodwill have been hesitant about this process is it's a lot harder than just being told what to think or how to act or what to do. It requires a lot more time. It's in some ways it's a mystical contemplative process, and the way in which you can spiritualize this away in ways that are not helpful, right? But if Karl Rahner said that the Christian of the future is going to be a mystic, there's a way in which this means that our communities have to have that level of commitment to each other to stay in place, even when there is not consensus but deep dissensus. Putting up with each other and still making these meetings, making these ways of discerning an act of faith in the Holy Spirit, continuing to somehow be present when we gather in God's name and try to have these conversations. So it's hard, and it's part of the reality that I think if we have too light a theology of synodality, we don't address how difficult this is and how spiritually and personally demanding it can be of individuals and of their communities.
But I think it also centers the importance of ritual itself, not just ritual formation, but, right, I mean, there's a way in which, okay, like American Catholics just think that, like you were saying, being Catholic is all about going to Mass and doing the thing and then going home and getting the sacraments and then leave. But there's also a way in which rituals make space for just doing together, right? Being in a same space, gathering in the same space, going through the same motions, standing shoulder to shoulder with people with whom you disagree radically, right? And there really is not another space in our society where you do that, where you gather to sing chorally, communally the same songs, where you gather to stand shoulder to shoulder with people that you are very different from and probably disagree with deeply, and all process together to receive the same sacrament, and then depart and do it all again next week. And so, right, I think there's a fear that people are saying, oh, well, if we're moving towards a synodal church, like they're just picturing a future in which their entire ecclesial existence is like meetings, which is like, no, I don't want that. But so I think it's important to hold, right? What's the center? The center is still our participation in the sacraments, right? We can still go through the motions together, which I say in the least pejorative way possible. There's something very important about going through the motions together. But now we also have this structure and method and mechanism by which we can hear and hold each other's voices as we process together toward the sacraments.
Speaking of formation, Raphael, you're in the room where it happens, in Frascati and in those areas, in the Vatican, where you're compiling all of these responses, where you're looking at this. What is it like when you're synthesizing these documents? What's the effect on you? What's the effect on the people you're working with? Going through, you're on the ground living this experience with a unique kind of global perspective.
To refer to a praxis, to put it in a personal way, but also something that can help us. In Latin America, theologians and bishops at least speak to each other and sit to each other in a table. But I was sitting in a table with a bishop and other lay people and two presbyters from different countries. And this bishop said, you know what, we cannot talk about ordination of women because that topic was closed by John Paul II. And all the ones that were there, including me, of course, we started to talk with him. At the end of the process of dialoguing that took a long time, the bishop had to accept, because it was not alone. It was a table with many other people with different positions, and it's not about the bishop changing his mind. It's about that the interaction, the practice, change the atmosphere to produce a different result, and was included the topic in a document. I'm talking in another document in Latin America, in the Ecclesial Assembly, and the topic was included because of that process. So dissensus and consensus, diversity and unity is possible when we have the practice of listening, dialoguing, knowing the arguments of the other, and that's what you were saying, that doesn't exist in our societies as much as we need them to exist. So the practice is about that. And to end, how do we teach in a classroom? And how do we live in a family? So if we don't have that practice in the family or in the classroom, how can we have it in the institution of the church? So I think it's all interconnected. No? How do we do theology synodally? Next year is going to be a congress at the Gregoriana about this topic, for example. It has to change the method, the practice.
And we have to wrap up in just a minute, but I just picking up on that, I have to be struck by just the very fact of this conversation, of theologians speaking about these things that a few years ago in the church that I reported on for many decades, you could not even speak about without having to look over your shoulder. Tell me about that. What is it like today being a theologian in the church in the United States?
I think it's a really interesting time. It's an amazing time to be a theologian in the Church of the United States, in part because I think there's oxygen in the room, or the bell jar has been lifted off. And that doesn't mean we're all one big happy family. If you come to any of our theology conferences, you can see that that isn't the case. I'll say for myself, I'm a gay Catholic man doing theology and able to do that in a way that I never expected was possible when I was 20 years old. And able to have a conversation with people who are still disagreeing with me, perhaps, and still are deeply concerned for LGBTQ folks and our choices. But I also think that there's a way in which that there's an openness to hear the stories of our lives as Catholics. And the language from the most recent document that kept getting repeated was the language of baptismal dignity. There's a way in which there's a recognition, not just among theologians, but I think that the current church in the United States has this air in the room to see each other face to face, to have some more I-thou relationships again in ways that are profoundly exciting and perhaps healthy, perhaps even holy.
Susan.
As a woman and as a mother, I think that this is a very exciting time to be a theologian, because my generation of women theologians we're really only a few generations in. Of course, we've had women theologians all the way down, but we called them mystics and visionaries and, hysterical, usually. But in terms of academic theologians, whenever I have women students who get discouraged because they're in a class full of men who are talking over them, I show them a picture from a CTSA banquet in the 50s, and it is all men in collars, and we love men in collars, but it's all men in collars. There's not a single woman in the room. There's not even really any visible laity in the room. And here we are 70 years later, and look who's in the room, right? We're not there yet, but we're on the way. And that, to me, gives me a lot of hope. I think it's also interesting to be a theologian in the United States of America in 2022, because what we've seen in vivid and horrifying ways over the past several years, decades, centuries, but really just we're talking about the current moment, right? All you have to do is turn on the news to see bad theology kills people. Bad theology kills people. This matters. It matters what we say about God. It matters how we think about the church. It matters what we think God thinks of us. It matters what we see when we look at each other. So I think that the task of the theologian has never been more urgent.
Raphael.
I think that theology should connect every day more with pastoral life. That's the only way to do not only a synodal theology, but a theology that translates into concept the experience of being, living, and interacting in a community with others. If that doesn't exist, theology becomes insignificant, irrelevant for an elite, all about concepts. So theology must depart from pastoral experience, and this is different than ministry. There is a difference between ministries and pastoral. Sometimes we are only emphasizing the ministerial side of our engagement with the church. The church has ministry, gifts, services, different ways of connecting and engaging with the society, the mission of the church. So I think that if we, in the case that I see, again from outside, in the US, that we are distancing and disconnecting ourselves with the pastoral life and emphasizing a ministry that is understood like a management of a parish, we are completely disconnected with the reality of the mission of the church. So I would only say that my experience as a lay person is that if I don't have a community where to share my life, theology has no meaning for me.
Thank you all very much. There's so much, I think some of the critiques are that we are trying to invent a new church. And what is clear from this moment and from this discussion to me is that it's a revelatory moment. This is a revelation, that it's revealing what has always existed. And in these documents, even our national American document was so surprisingly frank and honest. What it's really doing is revealing what's already there. It's revealing the church that's been covered up, but now we're being honest. So please, thank you so much for being here. Please join me in thanking our guests, Raphael, Susan, and Brian. I'm David Gibson, Director of the Center on Religion and Culture. Again, thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting us. And this great conversation will be on our YouTube channel in a few days after we do a bit of post-production on it. So we hope you'll share that. We'll send it out to everybody who RSVP'd to this event. Thank you. Good evening.